back to the Supreme Court. We're looking here at another Supreme Court case, but before we do that, we need to actually do one card, and this card is gerrymandering, which is probably a term you've heard of. You probably heard about this in U.S. history. 2.36, gerrymandering. I'll talk about the history of that in a second, but let's talk about what it means. It's to manipulate a boundary of an electoral district so that it favors one political party. And remember, this is going to happen during redistricting, because redistricting is when you redraw boundaries after a census. Remember, censuses happen every 10 years, years on the zero. So that's what gerrymandering is. The history of this is quite fascinating. It actually it's named after the former governor of Massachusetts, named Eldridge Gerry, back in the early 19th century. He actually ended up becoming vice president under Madison. And Gerry signed a bill that redrew boundaries that looked ridiculous. And these ridiculous boundaries ended up getting a cartoon made after them. You may have seen this cartoon before. This is the original gerrymander in a district outside of Boston. And the reason it's called a gerrymander is because it was Gerry, the governor, and then mander is because supposedly it looked kind of like a salamander, and then they added like claws and wings to it. I don't know. I guess the salamander could fly. But anyway, point is that that's where it comes from. So it's when you manipulate a boundary and the boundary looks ridiculous. All right, cool. Let's talk about that. Gerrymandering, by the way, here's like an example of like how gerrymandering can impact an election. So let's pretend you have 50 precincts. Remember, if you don't know, a precinct is where you go vote. A precinct might have 1,000 or 2,000 residents in it, but it's the place where you go vote. So let's pretend there are 50 precincts. Each has 2,000 voters in it. And so we're talking about 100,000 voters. There are 60% of these precincts are a majority Democrat, and 40% of them are majority Republican. Notice that you could draw these districts in such a way that there are 5 districts that all are going to be won by the Democrats, because each of them has 6 Democrat precincts and 4 Republican precincts. And so it's 5-0, right? I mean, they win all of them. But notice that you also can gerrymander them. Okay, so if that's just drawn districts straight up. Or you could gerrymander another way. So you got gerrymander in the first and then a gerrymander in the second. And this gerrymander over on the right actually ends up with 3 red districts and 2 blue districts. So you end up with like 2 hyper blue districts, super, super blue, and then you end up with 3 kind of almost middle of the road, 60-40 red districts. And so this is how gerrymandering can actually change representation. Remember, gerrymandering is done by the state legislatures, because state legislatures are in charge of redistricting. Here's a modern gerrymandering. These are actual gerrymanders in different states. Both Republicans and Democrats do this. And when one complains about the other doing it, as soon as they get power, they'll do it. You see Florida, the Illinois 4th. Look at Illinois 4th. It looks like a mouth. Illinois 7th, Maryland 2nd, Maryland 3rd, North Carolina 12th. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Ohio 9th, Pennsylvania 7th, Texas 35th. What the attempt is we're going to put all of one party into a district, so that way they don't make another district competitive. All right, you need your Supreme Court sheet. We've done this before. Not doing the pair reading unless we do it in class. We're going to start with unit, case name, issue. Remember, you're studying the clause, constitutional issue amendment, facts of the case, and then the ruling. Remember, those are the things that really, really matter here. All right, unit 2, the case name is Shaw versus Reno. This happened in 1993. The issue was racial gerrymandering. Shaw, by the way, was a resident of North Carolina. Reno was the Attorney General of the United States of America, who was overlooking the Civil Rights or the Voting Rights Act, and making sure that North Carolina was abiding by that. And one of the parts of the Voting Rights Act was if you can have a majority minority district, meaning there's more minorities in the district than whites, then you should. Okay, you shouldn't avoid that, because that was something that in the South happened a lot, where blacks could have made up a majority in places, but instead they would gerrymander it to make sure that whites had the majority, and that way no black person could ever get elected. All right, the key clause in amendment is going to be the 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause, just like our last case. So redrawing these districts is going to be falling under the Equal Protection Clause, 14th Amendment. Awesome. Pause if you need to. All right, facts. North Carolina draws 2 black majority districts after redistricting. North Carolina draws 2 black majority districts after redistricting. That's the legislature, by the way, the state legislature. They did that on purpose. They did this to make sure that that it was a higher likelihood that a black representative would actually get elected in the districts. One of the districts, though, was gerrymandered so bizarrely that it was no wider than the interstate. There was the old joke that you could like open your doors and you'd be the width of the actual district. It's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not very far away. All right, but it was no wider than the district than an interstate in places. You can see here on the map. Look at the purple district in the middle. That was the district. Pretty crazy. I mean, look at some places there in the middle. It's insane. All right. 5 North Carolina residents sue. 5 North Carolina residents sue. And they argue that the only purpose of drawing such a crazy gerrymandered district was to elect a black representative. Thus, this violates equal protection under the 14th Amendment. So they argue the only purpose of this district was to elect a black representative. Thus, it violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Awesome. All right, question. Is a racially gerrymandered district a valid complaint under the 14th Amendment? So again, this now jurisdiction-wise, this is federal law, so that there was no question that they could rule on it. But it still kind of comes a little bit under jurisdiction because, like, do you have the right to sue because of racially gerrymandering? So there's political gerrymandering where, like, I'm going to put all the Democrats in one district so that way I can have 3 Republican districts, or I'm going to put all the Republicans in a district so I can have 3 Democrat districts. That's political gerrymandering. That's the typical one. But now we're talking about sorting people racially. So that way, all the blacks will be in the same district. So that way they can elect a black representative. We call it a majority minority district. Majority is minority in that district. The question was 5-4. The vote was 5-4. The vote was 5-4 in favor of Shaw. And the answer was yes. This district in North Carolina was bizarre enough to suggest that it's sorting people by race. 5-4 for Shaw. Yes, this district is bizarre enough to suggest it is sorting people by race. And therefore, it's evidence. The evidence rises to equal protection violation. So basically, they're like, guess what, guys? You're going to have to go back and redraw that district. Now, there's a part of this ruling, though, that is a little bit of legalese. And legalese is like when you word something and you got to interpret what it means, and it's not very clear. And then this is what it says: boundaries cannot exceed what is reasonably necessary to avoid racial imbalances. Now, I'm sorry I got reasonably blocked out by my face. Apologize about that. Boundaries cannot exceed what is reasonably necessary. That's a quote from the actual decision. Reasonably necessary to avoid racial imbalances. So the question always comes down to with Shaw versus Reno is, well, what's reasonably necessary? Well, in this case, it exceeded what is reasonably necessary, like literally crazy to have it as wide as the highway. That's exceeding what is reasonably necessary. But if you have to kind of make a little bit of a wacky district and have to gerrymander some, then that's reasonably necessary. That's okay. So here's the key. You got to really focus on this. It's not that racial gerrymandering is always wrong. That's not the ruling. You can racially gerrymander, but you can't racially gerrymander to the point that it's exceeding what is reasonably necessary. Okay. So in this case, they thought this was exceeding reasonably necessary. But in another case, they may say, well, it's all right. It's kind of wacky, but not too bad. All right. And so just to share you one last thing, This just shows you how you could redraw districts in North Carolina based on gerrymandering, and you could, um, there's the District 9 you see in the top one, the blue one. That's actually how they were drawn. It was a Republican map drawn there, and then here's another one where you could redraw it in the middle, and you could end up with 9 Democrat districts and 4 Republican ones. Now, here's the one thing to remember: gerrymandering doesn't have as big an impact as we think it does, and here's why. Over time, population changes, people move, and that changes the composition of a district. And then the other thing to remember is that politics changes. And one district that you thought was going to be now safe for your party, suddenly in a change election, and we've had quite a few of them recently where there's been some major swings between the parties, suddenly it changes completely, and the district that you thought you were going to win now flips the other way. So it's not quite as obvious as a advantage as you might think it would be. All right, thanks, guys. Study this one, write it out. Remember, amendment, the facts, and the ruling. Bye.